I am the co-founder and CEO of Smile API. And this afternoon, I would like to share with you a couple of thoughts about the data gap and how to address it. So specifically, what can we do in Southeast Asia to foster financial inclusion, specifically when we're talking about employment data. So maybe as a first, to define the problem definition, what we have is we have 7 out of 10 people in Southeast Asia that are underbanked or completely unbanked. So what does that mean? Underbanked essentially means you do not have any access to any financial services beyond your bank account, and unbanked, obviously, you don't have any bank account. So let's take a look at what the reasons for that are, mostly in Southeast Asia. So specifically, we're talking about an environment where we have no data or no traditional data. So in traditional data, meaning we don't have any credit card transactions, we do not have any credit scores, we do not have anything that really covers us in terms of a service provider that would be able then to provide us with any financial services. They typically need it in order to originate loans. So an interesting thing is that almost everyone has a job. So this is a particular interesting point, because when we're looking at the point of alternative data, and specifically their employment data, there has been a major shift during the pandemic. So a lot of the jobs actually have moved online. A lot of the jobs have actually been digitized, and that creates a huge wave of data that is actually quite valuable. And so just to show this a little bit in more detail, we're looking at the Philippines, where we currently have around 45 million workers, a big chunk of the population, and they're really in their prime. It's a growing and young workforce there. When we're looking at Southeast Asia as a whole, we have typically like a sum of over 300 million people, and when we're looking at all of Asia, there's over 1 billion people that are participating in the workforce. And what I just mentioned is that there is a lot of change in terms of data that is happening there. So where does it happen? Specifically, we're looking at mobile, there's e-commerce, a lot of data in the cloud, and a lot of data actually coming into e-governments, right? So e-governments are also developing. I think Singapore is a perfect example for that when we're looking at SingPass, but also in other parts of the world, we see that specifically in the workspace, there is a lot of change. Now, just as a couple of examples here, when we're looking at the BPO sector in the Philippines, or when we're looking at delivery, all of these things move into cloud-based payroll systems. We have delivery platforms that carry data about transactions. How much do you earn? How much do you spend? How much do you make? Minute by minute, sometimes by the second. There is so much data that is being processed. So, and none of these flags actually symbolize that we're, particularly only focusing on one industry that corresponds to that particular country. But perhaps if we're looking at, so for instance, Indonesia, or this happens in other countries, like warung stores, or sari-sari, they're called in the Philippines, like small retail stores that are now connecting to micro ERP systems that have access to a whole lot of data in terms of the supply chain. Where do they actually get the goods from? How do they sell it? Because these are sole proprietors in many cases, this equals to their personal income. But in the past, you were not able to really leverage this kind of information to issue a loan, to become banked, or to actually leverage this for all kinds of other services, or to get access to that. Same applies for factory workers. Yeah? A lot of the factory work right now is timed and paid online. So a lot of that work actually moves to the cloud, and also the reporting to the government. I'll go to that in just a second. It's a very interesting shift. And the pandemic was one of the catalysts to really accelerate this kind of data. Now, when we're looking at the next step, and that's a quite interesting one because there's also a lot of challenges. If we would like to leverage employment data in the financial services space or beyond, there is the main challenge of distribution. So when we're looking at typically a country like the Philippines or even Indonesia, right? In the US, we have around 1 million employers only in the SME sector. When we're looking at the Philippines, at least there is 100,000 employers, small or big. right? So how do you actually access this data? That's the question that we're going to address. And how do you structure it? Yeah. So this is a very important question. So in order to actually create some use cases that are really impactful, we have to first create some sort of like a categorization. So we have to be able to understand how do we actually see this data and how do we make it valuable on use case by use case basis. So particularly when we're looking at some sort of like what we discussed about open banking. So if this is open, if we discussed open banking before, this is open employment. So employment information has very, very valuable information in it, specifically when you structure it by employers, government systems, and gig platforms. You see that there is identity, there is employment data, what's the name of the employer, what is the time of the tenure. Imagine an underwriter or a bank would like to know how long have you been actually working for this employer before they issue a loan to you. How long what is the actual income? What is the income progression? Is it rising? Is it plateauing? Is it falling? And even at an aggregated level, this is quite valuable for underwriting purposes and even for making macroeconomic decisions. But there are other use cases that are, I would say, more, more worldly. Perhaps, just as for a case for employment, right? If you would like to conduct a background check, this is also quite valuable information. But in either case, definitely there is structure that is required. And now we're coming a little bit into the API space. So it's how do you design an API that it actually becomes valuable for a consumer being at a financial services institution or being an employer that is employing hundreds of thousands of people on an annual basis at a mass scale, right? So you want to look at the structure of the API. So typically, for different schemas, we have different, or for different use cases, there are different schemas. And so what we typically are looking at is identity. Then we have different schemas for employment or for income. And there's a whole bunch of others that might be very valuable, specifically when we're looking at more limited use cases or more isolated use cases, such as, what are the assets essentially? Yeah. So for securitized lending, would be very interesting. What collaterals can come into the contract? Is there a car? Is there a vehicle? Is there real estate involved? And all of this information, in some cases, is, imagine you're an Airbnb host, right? This information is already there. You just have to pick the use case and make it valuable and bring it to a consumer on the other side. And in the middle, and this is the wonderful thing where we come into compliance, sits the data subject. They are deciding what to do with this kind of data. And so this is also another section that I would like to address in just a bit. But first and foremost, I think I already made clear that there are so many use cases that are applicable for employment information. But specifically when we look at why, we have identified 4 cornerstones. And the first of which is truth. So we're talking about truth specifically in an environment where we really rely on real data. Is this data true? How is the veracity of the information? So specifically, we know that work is one of the most highly regulated environments that there is because obviously it is the basis for taxation. So there is the regulator that has an interest in that, for instance, your payroll information is accurate, you have an interest in that, and everybody is keeping checks on this information because it is the basis for taxation, and after all, it is your income. So in a lot of situations, truth is very important, and here we have a very high level of veracity. The next one would be timeliness. Yeah, so you have a lot of data that doesn't change. So for instance, maps, they do change. Somewhere here and there a road is built. But when we're looking at employment, this can change from one month to the other. It's not as fast as financial data, such as a ticker, but before you underwrite a loan, before you underwrite an individual's loan or a business loan, you definitely want to check what's the latest data. So the timeliness is also very important, and this can be updated through the API on a regular basis. Relevance. Yes. Is it relevant? Is it relevant? Yes or no? Well, do you want to look at the income before you make a loan for someone? Yes. You also want to make sure that this cannot be tampered with, right? So you can actually only go to the source that everybody has been agreeing on, which is the the payroll system, the social security system, contributions, etc. This is the single source of truth. Actually, when we're looking at, I'm often asked, who is your competitor? And then I say my competitor would be the status quo, because a lot of the underwriting right now in lesser developed economies actually happens by scanning a payslip. And a payslip can be easily manipulated. Just fact aside that a payslip is, a piece of paper that you have to scan with your phone. I mean, not really where we are right now. So relevance, and then availability. So I just mentioned it. A piece of paper is probably not as available as an API, or even if the data source of the API is itself an online resource or something that lives in the cloud. The availability is always there. So next question perhaps could be, what are the use cases, obviously? And so specifically what we're looking at is in financial services. I'm not going to dive really deep into this, but it's obvious. Lending, buy now, pay later, personal lending, then earned wage access. So all of that falls into this category of underwriting or fintech. And then there is banking, card issuing, but there are also other use cases, specifically recruitment, rental verification when we have relationships between tenants and landlords, as well as other services that are super exciting for us to see that there are startups coming up that are trying to build on the infrastructure that Smile provides. And yeah, these are very interesting use cases to see as well. Now, when we're talking about the next step, that would be data access. So one of the core questions that a lot of times we're being asked is, how do you access the data? How do you actually get access to this employment data? And we always say we're a middleware or broker in between. We're not actually accessing the data. We're just a tool for the data subject or the borrower or the employee, all in one person, that can be used in order to get this data out of the server, out of the ground, so to say. If we take an oil analogy, right? So without us, it's really hard to actually get the data, but we cannot do it without the data subject. Now, the first step then would be in an application like this to have an SDK that we are integrating into our client's app. And this SDK provides a front end essentially to the end user that lets them, first of all, give them consent. So the consent has to be very clear and very concise. It says like what kind of data is being accessed and for what purpose. So there is a legitimate cause for that. And the next step would be we're using a login name and a password in an encrypted fashion. And then we can access the data. And the success screen would basically lead them back into the main process of continuing their business. So this would enable millions and millions of people in Southeast Asia to essentially get access to financial service as long as they are employed within a matter of seconds. It also depends on the sophistication of the client. So some clients are still processing this information in a manual way. But a lot of them are actually connecting to APIs already. And so it's very exciting to see what's happening here. Now, we see some sophistication on the client side, but how about actually the end user, right? So this is always a question that we have been observing over the past 2 years, where we see some sort of like a mind shift. In the beginning, customers were really reluctant to actually provide this kind of information, but since we actually see that there is a very interesting trade-off between the customer, first of all, that shows, well, this is actually quite helpful. This can help me to get to my loan. This can help me to get to my job much faster. This can help me to get to whatever service I would like. And on the other hand, is my data safe? So who's actually processing my data here? And the single most significant answer to help to answer this question is really to create visibility. So visibility really creates trust, specifically when we give an option to, for instance, deconnect or disconnect an account. To actually, before the data is being shared, pretty much like we see with SyncPass, to provide the information that is being shared prior to it being shared. So this is actually something that leads to a situation where we see more and more customers, more and more end users actually are adopting this kind of technology because it works for them. It really reduces friction in a market where you typically, in order to get an employment verification, have to travel for half a day through a city like Manila or Jakarta to go to an HR department and get something, you know, like chopped and then bring it to a bank. So more and more people are actually accepting this, and this is an exciting time, specifically for APIs in the employment space. And yeah, this concludes my quick discussion. I think 15 minutes is fine. So perhaps if there are any questions, I'm happy to help you to answer them. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Jerome. I have a couple of questions, unless someone in the audience would like to go first. Okay. So the data, what are the regulations around the data? Because as you mentioned, employment data, the truthfulness, the veracity of employment data is very important from a point of view. Probably also employment laws to ensure that people are being paid the appropriate wage for maybe unions involved and other. So what is the the regulations around the use of employment data? Is that evolving also?
Yeah, so there's a piece of legislation, but pretty much like the GDPR in the EU. When we're looking at the Philippines, there's something called the DPA, or Data Protection Act from 2012, which clearly regulates privacy and data and around it. And there's a commission, as mentioned by Todd before, it's called the NPC. So you go ahead and you register your company, and you register. Now, lately, there's also a new way of registering yourself and your system, right? So the system comes under surveillance by the regulator, which is a good thing. And so that's what you typically do. There is no clear regulation or even license, particularly that regulates employment data, or you know, for that matter, banking data, what we discussed before. Yeah, but you know, I'm happy to write a piece of regulation and to present it to the regulators. But so far, I think the space is just moving so much faster than the regulators can even think. And this is yeah, perhaps something for the future.
Well, great. Thanks very much for sharing that.